Good morning. My name is Jane Wilf. Thank you for joining us on our Community Mission webinar on Shared Society in Israel. I'm excited to see that people from all over Greater Metro West are virtually joining us. If you have busmates and friends who are unable to join us this morning, please know that we will be sharing a link to the presentation in the coming days. 4 weeks from tonight, we will be at our opening dinner in Tel Aviv. As we have discussed how to best prepare everybody for this trip of a lifetime, we knew we needed an ongoing communication, a good packing list, and a few events. But in addition, we wanted to provide an opportunity to be briefed on current political landscape in Israel, a chance to understand the history, everyday realities, and a forecast for the future of the different headlines that we see in the news and on social media. I am grateful to Dov Ben-Shimon, the CEO and Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, for serving as our presenter this morning. Dov was born in England and moved to Israel at the age of 18. He holds a BA and an MA in International Relations from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Dov began his tenure as our CEO in 2014. He previously served in senior leadership roles at the Joint Distribution Committee and the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. Dov will speak for approximately 20 minutes. There will be slides accompanying him on the screen. If you have questions that would like to be answered, please hover your mouse over the black bar at the bottom of the Zoom window. An icon Q&A should appear. Please click on that, type in your question, and hit enter. We will be fielding your questions at the end of Dov's presentation.
My privilege to speak with you today on some of the key issues that are likely to be helpful, useful, and interesting as we think about Israel diaspora relations and what we're going to see on our community mission. I know that some of us have been to Israel many times, and some of us have never been. Some of us have strong opinions and views on the issues we're going to look at today, and some of us are coming to a completely new story. So on the one hand, we'll cover a few of the basics. But on the other hand, we'll try to make this interesting and useful and give you a taste of some of the challenges and issues that we'll encounter on the ground. And remember, I'm partly Israeli, so it's rude to not disagree with me at some point. But I want to start with a story. There I was, watching a friend getting married in Jerusalem. It was a beautiful wedding at the Kol HaNeshama Reform Synagogue, which you can see here. The ceremony was conducted by Rabbi Levi Wyman Kelman, a 10th generation Jerusalem rabbi. But this wedding, even though it was completely done to halachic standards, wasn't recognized by the Orthodox rabbinate, which means that it wasn't recognized by the State of Israel. And in order for you to understand what happened next, let me tell you another story first. In 1947, David Ben-Gurion, then head of the Jewish Agency, kind of the government in waiting, sent a letter to the ultra-Orthodox Agudat Yisrael party. Ben-Gurion wanted to form a unified Jewish front as the United Nations discussed Israeli statehood. Here's the deal, he said. Support the Unified Front for Independence and you get the following 4 compromises. Shabbat would be the official day of rest in the new Jewish state. Official government kitchens would keep kosher. Personal status would be governed by rabbinic courts, meaning there'd be no civil marriage, and full educational autonomy for different Jewish denominations, with basic standards of minimums in science and history and so on. And that's why we're talking today. This letter, the status quo letter from June 1947, became the basis for regulating religion and state in Israel to this day. And the status quo arrangements officially recognize the authority of only the Orthodox rabbinate on all personal status issues in Israel. So for decades now, the halachic definitions of Orthodox Judaism, once a building block, have become a political stumbling block in the relations between the more conservative religious community and the state and secular Jews in Israel, not to mention diaspora Jews. And it clashes with another foundational document which many of you have seen or heard of, and that's Israel's Declaration of Independence. To this day, literally, we're arguing about the balance of rights that the Declaration lays out. The State of Israel will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. Just last month, the Knesset continued to debate on issues that were originally raised in the Declaration of Independence. This was the latest round of the nation-state law, which does three basic things. First, it states that the right to exercise national self-determination in Israel is unique to the Jewish people. Second, it establishes Hebrew as Israel's official language and downgrades Arabic from an equal language to a special status. And third, it establishes Jewish settlement as a national value and mandates that the state of Israel will labor to encourage and promote its establishment and development. Most of this was symbolic and largely declarative, but it was met with worldwide criticism, including from many in the American Jewish community. So remember, we don't have a written constitution in Israel, and there's no separation of religion and state like in the United States. So precedents, agreements, norms, laws become part of an unwritten constitutional framework. And the secular religious divide ripples through a whole series of complicated areas. Who serves in the army, who has the right to make aliyah, who's allowed to legally get married, and so on. Some of the more troubling elements of this have included demands to bury non-halakhically Jewish IDF soldiers outside of cemeteries because they weren't seen as Jewish enough. And a particularly shameful episode a few weeks ago in which a conservative rabbi, Dubi Chayun, was arrested and brought to police detention at 5 in the morning for performing illegal weddings without authorization from the chief rabbin. Other elements of the status quo come from traditional precedent, but they don't have consistent logic behind them. For example, there's a ban against public transport on Shabbat, except where it was common before the founding of the state. So you can ride a bus in Haifa on Saturday morning, but not in Jerusalem. And because 400 yeshiva students were exempted from army service in 1948 to refill the ranks of Torah scholarship destroyed in the Holocaust, we now have 60,000 who are exempt from army service, from 400 exemptions to 60,000 a year. Now, don't misunderstand, all of this seemed to work more or less for many years. The Labour Party was committed to the status quo because Ben-Gurion had signed it. And even when the Likud rose to power in 1977 under Menachem Begin, the traditional population was much more focused on national unity and the security agenda. I think that you could legitimately argue that the Israeli courts were much less inclined than today to challenge the rules and regulations that the status quo agreement required, but not anymore. Today, the status quo is increasingly questioned and not taken for granted. Israelis are less religious and traditional. They're less bound by these kinds of agreements. The immigration of about 1 million speaking Russian immigrants, many of whom aren't counted by the Orthodox rabbinate as Jewish, and most of whom aren't practicing religion at all, changed the demographic debate. Remember, these are full Israeli citizens, but many aren't seen by the state as Jewish. Many of them don't want to be Jewish, even though they're Israeli citizens. But since marriage is controlled by state religious courts, they're stuck. About 400,000 Russian-speaking immigrants were Jewish enough to make aliyah under the law of return, but not Jewish enough to be allowed to marry as Jews inside Israel because there's no civil marriage. In the same way, there are increasing calls for fairness in government allocations to schools and institutions. People want to go shopping or go to the movies on Shabbat. They want fairness. And they don't want to be forced to do things against their will to get basic services from the state. If my kids have to be drafted for compulsory army service, is it fair that your kids are exempt, for example, just because they claim to be studying Torah? Israel's system of government plays a huge role here. Since the founding of the state, no one single party has formed a majority government by itself. Government coalitions usually contain a stipulation that the status quo on matters of religion has to be maintained so that the main party can still get ultra-Orthodox support. I wanted you to see that basic distribution of seats from the last election in 2015. I didn't deliberately choose a difficult to read map of Knesset seats. It just really is difficult to read. But even a quick glance at the distribution of seats shows you how much you need to negotiate, how difficult it is to get what you want in Israeli politics, how much you need to barter, to compromise, to give and take. Keep that fact in mind as we talk about politics and religion and the art of compromise for a moment. In the last few years, we've seen the deaths of some of the politically moderate Haredi leaders, ultra-Orthodox leaders in Israel, like Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Eliashiv, Rabbi Yehuda Steinman. The practical effects of their deaths has been that we're now seeing a much more extreme Orthodox leadership and factions, which makes it much harder to compromise. And this is in a context where every decision and statement is scrutinized by the ultra-Orthodox media, which is very active and strident. There are massive ultra-Orthodox protests in Jerusalem against the army draft on a regular basis, because these kinds of protests solidify coalitions and dissent. So you see extreme rulings as a tool for building religious legitimacy. As religious parties become more and more susceptible to their extremes, it becomes more and more difficult to build stable coalitions that rely on cooperation between secular and religious parties. And more people are dissatisfied with that situation. And all this leads to things like being forced to have an Orthodox wedding or not being allowed to take public transport on Shabbat. There are lots of examples of these kinds of glaring differences. I didn't share them to try to overwhelm you. I just want to give you a sense of the layers and layers of complexities that come into play here. Because remember that how we count Israelis is important too. By most counts, of the 81% of Israelis who are Jewish, the basic definitions are 40% secular and 23% traditional, with only 10% religious and 8% ultra-Orthodox. There are some differences around the margins, but for the most part, these are fairly consistent percentages wherever you go to. So let's spend a minute on one key issue here, and that's Judaism's holiest site, the Kotel, the Western Wall. Everyone is welcome to approach and pray at the Western Wall. There are two sections separated by gender. Not only are the sections not equal size, but you're not allowed to have mixed gender prayer services in the large plaza behind the wall. And you're not allowed to bring in Torah scrolls from off-site either. What you do have is a much smaller temporary platform for non-Orthodox Jewish prayer in the area next to the Western Wall and south of the Kotel Plaza. This is in the active archaeological site of Robertson's Arch. This egalitarian prayer space isn't visible or easily accessible from the main Western Wall Plaza. The steps leading down to the egalitarian section are slippery and dangerous. The Orthodox authorities at the Kotel, who are paid civil servants, will deny to your face that the egalitarian section even exists. We made huge progress on this issue in January 2016. For 4 years, the Israeli government negotiated with the Reform and Conservative movements, the Jewish federations, and a group called the Women of the Wall. This massive negotiation led to an agreement to create a permanent and official, fully egalitarian space. We would have had an expanded and safe place for egalitarian prayer. It would have had a shared entrance, not a hidden one, with a clear statement that the wall belongs to everyone. The decision created an uproar from ultra-Orthodox government officials. There were rounds of appeals in the Supreme Court, and in June of last year, the government voted to freeze the Kotel agreement due to ultra-Orthodox pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. What you need to remember is that there's no history of the Western Wall being an Orthodox synagogue, or there being a mechitza, a division between men and women there. It's just the way it is now. The wall, like the old city, was captured from the Jordanians in 1967 in the Six-Day War, and a few weeks later was given by the army to the Ministry of Religious Affairs, which turned the entire area, essentially, into an Orthodox synagogue. Just so you can see how famous my backside was in the Jerusalem Post of last year, this is me and my colleague Naomi Adler, the executive of the Philadelphia Jewish Federation, last year at the egalitarian section of the Kotel. Now, in the last few weeks, we've heard of a new initiative through the Jerusalem municipality to bypass the government using accessibility laws to create wider pathways and safer entranceways to the egalitarian section. So this will almost certainly be a point for our discussion when we get there. We're going to have time on the mission to hear different sides of this issue, to debate, to discuss, to visit. We're not going to impose on anyone a visit to one section or the other, but you'll have an opportunity to visit when we get there. Gil Meir asked, what's the mainstream Israeli view as it pertains to shared society and pluralism? So that's a good question. there have been a vast number of opinion polls about all of these issues. Generally, you should know that about 4 out of 5 Israelis support, for example, some kind of equal space for non-Orthodox Jews at the Kotel. But just because Israelis support change doesn't mean that they'll push for it. Compared to national security or economics, Israelis don't care very much about religion and state in the way that we do. Religious issues don't often register when you poll about the most important issues for Israelis in elections. And even within the realm of religious reform, the Western wall ranks pretty low for many Israelis. They're much more likely to campaign for changes that affect their lives on a daily basis, like civil marriage or an expansion of the army draft. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about the Kotel. Symbols are important for us too, because they represent what we think about ourselves and what people think about us. After all, if we keep hearing from Israeli politicians that we're all one family, but our symbols are kind of meaningless and not very important, then that says something about how they see us too. Everyone still with me? Let's spend the final few minutes talking about what our federation is doing and why that's important. You've probably figured out that Israeli and American Jews are very different on several levels. Israelis are more conservative, most diaspora Jews are more liberal. American Jews tend to vote Democratic, Israelis are more hawkish. Those kinds of differences in perspective provide a richness to our dialogue so long as we're all tolerant and respectful. But the divide on religion and state is an altogether different issue. Because Israelis and many Americans express their Judaism so differently, we're no longer seeing eye to eye on these issues. A lot of American Jews are upset, and a lot of Israelis don't understand why we're so upset. 22 years ago, we created a religious pluralism committee in our federation. The idea was to allocate some campaign dollars to pluralistic programs in Israel and also offer a voice to some of the different streams of Jewish life. It wasn't about politics. It was a genuine attempt to say that we have certain values and principles in our love for Israel that we want to see as part of this discussion. I have to tell you on a personal note that around this time I was working as a fundraiser in the Israeli reform movement in Jerusalem. One of our biggest PR campaigns was this terrific bus stop poster, which you can see here, which was frequently burned or ripped apart and thrown in the trash in Orthodox areas. We were strongly supported by the then Metro West Federation. Even then, 20 years ago, Metro West was a leader on tolerance and diversity in Israel. And what began as a tactical response to a crisis became one of our federation's most successful, sustainable, and strategic long-term investments in Israel. Today, our federation funds hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of pluralism initiatives every year. We'll have a list of those programs and the amounts we fund available to you on the ground. We not only allocate funds to important programs, but Amir and Michal and Ta'ir, our staff on the ground, work tirelessly to educate the community on the importance of a pluralistic Israel, the need to help create it with Israelis, and to understand that the future health of Israel relies on its character as a Jewish and democratic state, no less than on its security and military power. It's clear to us that pluralistic forms of Judaism are not recognized, not funded, and not legitimized by the government of Israel. And our federation has consistently said that we don't accept this. It's not a political issue. It's an attack on our Jewish communal identity, on the status of our rabbis, and our connections to the Jewish state. Our friend, the Israeli Consul General in New York, Ambassador Danny Dayan, likes to say that American and Israeli Jews are in a Catholic marriage. We can't divorce, we're stuck together. And we're not going to disengage or disconnect because we love Israel. We like to say in Metro West that we live Israel. So part of our mission is to foster Israeli efforts to develop diverse approaches to Jewish practice and to promote unity, respect, and tolerance, to promote the understanding that Judaism isn't one size fits all. Unity doesn't mean uniformity. We've partnered and funded again and again with Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox programs to level the playing field by supporting programs that the state and the Orthodox establishment will not fund. But we've also supported unaffiliated projects and organizations. We were one of the first Jewish federations to understand that the Jewish identity of secular Israelis isn't necessarily connected to the synagogue movements like we have here. So we funded some amazing forms of creative connections and expression, and we'll show you some of those on the mission. It's also really important that you understand that our federation doesn't partner with the Israeli government. We have no real government ties. It continually astonishes me when I hear someone say, I don't like what the Israeli government is doing in this thing or that thing, and therefore I'm not supporting federation. We're nothing to do with the government, and you shouldn't confuse us with what the government is doing. When we're on the ground, you'll also see what we call living bridges between Greater Metro West and our partnership regions. Many of them have community-related programs where we support Jewish identity projects in Ofakim, Merchavim, and Arad, in the Metro West School in Ra'anana, in the Matnas in Ramat Eliyahu, and more. We've also focused increasingly on advocacy in the public sphere because our federation system has supported such a great number of Israelis in finding access to their Jewish identity. I know that many of you have met our Rishonim and Shlichim when they've worked here in New Jersey. But think about the impact of hundreds of returned Greater Metro West Shlichim and thousands, literally thousands, of returned North American Shlichim when they come home to Israel after serving here. They've sat in synagogues with men and women sitting together as a perfectly acceptable option. They've heard women reading from Torah. Some of them came here and did their bar or bat mitzvah here in New Jersey. They own their Jewish identity in a way that they want to find back home in Israel. And that's a really powerful message of change and impact. Remember the wedding story that we started off with? The Jerusalemites who were married by a 10th generation rabbi in a Reform synagogue, but whose marriage wasn't recognized by the state of Israel? For their honeymoon, the newly unrecognized newlyweds went to Vegas. And in Vegas, on their honeymoon, they had a second marriage ceremony conducted by an Elvis impersonator. And since that wedding ceremony was legally recognized by the state of Nevada, it was also recognized by the state of Israel, which recognized that lovely couple as now legally married. So think about that for a moment. A halakhically correct and appropriate wedding by a 10th generation rabbi in Jerusalem isn't kosher, but a wedding performed by an Elvis impersonator in Las Vegas is completely recognized in the Jewish state. I just want to make sure that you fully understand this. So let me just repeat this. A halakhically correct and appropriate wedding by a 10th generation rabbi in Jerusalem isn't kosher. But a wedding performed by an Elvis impersonator in Las Vegas is completely recognized by the Jewish state. We're going to have the chance to grapple with these issues when we hit the ground. The right to marry, to be recognized as a Jew, to be free to travel when you want to be free to live in the Jewish state. So here are a few of my conclusions for what we can bring with us. First, we're going to disagree, and that's okay. But we need to be respectful and tolerant when we do so. Second, we're all learning. No one possesses absolute truth. Third, we're respectful of the democratic process in Israel, although we recognize that democracy isn't just majority rule. And finally, we represent a federation with major investments and commitments to Israel's security, society, and people. We deserve to speak our minds, and we shouldn't be shy about it. And with that, I'm happy to answer a few questions. We've got a few here. Here we go. When are the next elections due, and who's going to win? So this is a great question. If you remember the piece that we showed earlier, the slide that we showed earlier, the last elections were in 2015, and the next ones have to be within 4 years of 2015. The rumors we're hearing on the political sphere have said that there will possibly be a move next month, potentially around the time that we hit the ground, in the Knesset for the government coalition to push for early elections, late fall, early winter, or early spring of 2019. If that's the case, that's probably because the governing coalition thinks it has higher odds of winning. And if you look at the recent opinion polls that are looking at the current voting predictions, it does seem like Netanyahu's Likud party has a higher chance of gaining more seats than any other party. But as we said earlier, there's absolutely no prediction of any party winning an overall majority, which means coalitions, which means negotiating and bargaining. Another question: how many Israelis belong to the non-Orthodox movements? So the reason this is such a great question is because the answer is we don't know. And there's a reason that we don't know. It's because if you go to an Orthodox synagogue, and if you belong to any of the facilities and frameworks and institutions that are classed as modern Orthodox or Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, they are paid for by the state. So technically, no one joins Orthodox synagogues in the way that you have to in Israel. Join a Reform or a conservative or a progressive synagogue and pay your membership dues. Our friends and partners in the progressive movement say to us somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 Israelis pay meaningful annual dues to Reform synagogues and institutions on a regular basis. They will also say that if you count up all the people that take part in some form of Reform or conservative or progressive institutional ceremony or event, it's more than half of Israeli Jews. So the number is somewhere between several 100,000 and several million, depending on how we count Jews, how we count participation, and how we count membership and affiliation. We are all out of questions. So I am deeply grateful for this time that we had together. I am going to do my best to spend time on each bus and with each group somehow during our time together on the mission. But you can reach me before or after the mission by email or by phone, and we can continue this discussion. Before I hand back to Jane for the final farewell, I just want to wish everyone Tzom Kal, a meaningful fast, and Gmar Chatima Tova. May we all be sealed in the book of life. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dov, for this engaging presentation. We look forward to the continuing discussion and many others on the mission. If you would like to attend some additional Federation-sponsored events on this subject, please hold the following dates. On the evening of October 31st, Dr. Dan Ben-David will be speaking on Israel at the Crossroads, Shaping the Future of the Nation at NJPAC. Sunday, November 11th, in partnership with the Honey Foundation, we will be hosting a talk with Rabbi Seth Farber and some of our community keeping Israel Jewish and democratic, the role of the diaspora Jewry. And on the evening of Wednesday, November 28th, Dr. Arnie Eisen, the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, will be here. See you at the PEP rally on Thursday, October 4th. Thank you so much for joining us.